Welcome, everyone, to the Ops Show, where we bring you the trials and tribulations, the collaborations and automations from the world of DevOps. I'm your host, Tristan Pollock, and I'm here with Kyle Campbell, the CEO of CTO.ai, and we're going to get into what's happening this week in DevOps.
This is going to be fun, Tristan. What do we got up this week?
Yeah, well, let me pop into the Slack community, the Ops community here, and let's pick out some of the latest pieces being shared.
Awesome.
One of the exciting news from the world of, let's say, chat ops is Atlassian buying the Helpdesk, the Slack first Helpdesk company, Help.
Yeah, I saw this. I saw that that Stuart tweeted it, as well as some of the other people at Slack. And I don't know these guys directly, but they are another company within Slack portfolio. And so this is a really exciting win. And I think my first impression was it shows how bigger companies right now, like Atlassian, who are huge, are thinking about Slack as a primary interface for where the future of their workflows are going. So this was really interesting to me because it shows a company who I think was relatively early stage. Maybe want to click into the link there just to get a bit more info on it. But, my perception of it at the surface level was, wow, this is really exciting for anyone who's building in Slack.
Yeah, not only do they have a great name, but that, companies that are almost solely operating inside of Slack now are, getting this attention, even if it's not their own native technology, where Atlassian has their own competitor to Slack. So it's interesting to look at from that angle as well. And are they getting it solely to move into the Slack ecosystem, or do they want to take Slack ecosystem products and put it into their own products? It'll be interesting to see what happens here.
Yeah, my impression is that most of the companies who have integrated into Slack, sort of what I would call in the first wave of Slack adoption, were more integrating like a feature rather than a Slack first experience around their product. And I think this kind of represents a bit of a tipping point where companies are starting to think about what Slack first or what chat first might even mean. And my guess is that this is, as a result of the big shift to remote and knowing that Slack is sort of the center of where people start their workday, to be honest with you. We always say it's where communication and collaboration happens, but it's kind of the jump off point. So I think there's this big trend now, or at least I'm hoping, this is the trend that I see, is that it's sort of shifting from this idea of like, well, Slack is a place that we offer a little bit of an integration. Maybe we send a notification there, maybe you can click a few buttons, to more like, well, Slack is where the jump off point is. And I think some of the earlier stage companies and entrepreneurs are all understanding this, and this is where they see a great opportunity around Slack. It's certainly where we do. But it's great to see a large company like Atlassian double down on their Slack first strategy.
Yeah, it's and I like how you're saying there with Slack being the place where you start your workday. For me, it's often this place I start and end. And I think honestly, with our time together, Kyle here at CTO.ai, I've it's really the email killer line has really resonated with me, where we're pretty much Slack first, Slack always.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess one other piece of news here, which, not to shift gears too quick, but there was also that little hiccup the other day, which got reported, I think, even in Business Insider, where the whole world shut down for a minute. I don't know if you can pull up that article or not, or find that real quick, but obviously, I think that's the first time I've seen any downtime from Slack, a 503 service message. But honestly, it was only for about 15 minutes. And for a moment, my world fell apart. I was like, oh my God, what do I do? How do I? But, there's such a great team over there. The technology team there is amazing. They had it back up in 15 minutes. It's incredible to me. One of our internal engineers posted a note on this, which I thought was really funny. They posted a note about, your company is at the center of people's universe when Business Insider does a big article on 15 minutes of downtime, when that's like literally the only 15 minutes of downtime you've pretty much ever had. And so that says to me, in conjunction with some of these other things that we've seen, that the movement to chat first and just Slack being at the center of it is definitely here to stay.
Yeah, right. 15 minutes of downtime. And I'm curious, what the reasons were, but really, honestly, they were probably mostly positive reasons where they're just getting so much usership now, so much adoption that they're reaching these thresholds that they've never been at before.
Yeah, I would guess so. I mean, you kind of got to expect that, right? Like, they're reporting such tremendous user growth that it has to be that. And I'm just gonna switch over here to my other screen. I think we might even be able to find out if we just hit up status.slack.com. This is where I go anytime there's any kind of like concern about outages or disruption or anything. I mean, you can see here they've got immaculate uptime. 99.96 is incredible, frankly. And let me make this a little bit bigger. And then here you can see the history. And so what I noticed from the history was, here you go, on the 12th, there was a small amount here, and they have a pretty detailed explanation about what's going on. And you can see here the infrastructure scaling up to handle volume in North America. I mean, that's clearly one of the driving factors, is that everybody's migrating to this chat first model, especially right now. And I've talked to some of the DevOps and SRE engineers over there, and it's no small feat to keep such a tremendous amount of daily or active users. I think they even track users who are connected by the second, is how they don't measure by daily active users like most people. They more so like look at concurrently connected by the second users. So it's a pretty incredible thing. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that actually brings up an interesting point that I think that we saw another piece of news in the Slack community this week was, the different, like, there's everything's been opified. There's a lot of X ops, DevOps, privacy ops, AI ops, chat ops, Slack ops. What do you feel like is behind this? Is it just flashy trends and keywords, or is there a real breakdown of opifying everything that could be part of this trend from Atlassian to the future of where technology is going and breaking down things into smaller, let's say, containers or packages?
Yeah, I think this is a trend that started a while ago, and obviously we named it the Ops platform because I think at the center of this trend is just the idea of automation and opifying, as you would say. I think it started out with DevOps, and then you sort of started hearing it in RevOps, revenue operations, sales ops. You started seeing it in marketing ops, or and then I think more it's sort of just like the niche verticalization of these different ideas around how do you automate workloads for your team. I think we're just sort of in this new era of working where companies are realizing that the more that they can automate the work that they do, the more they can empower their teams, the more their teams can spend time on more meaningful and creative work. And I think we're seeing that companies are really starting to, especially technology companies, this is the natural trend, is they're kind of moving up the stack and going, okay, well, how can we reduce some of that low-hanging fruit? I guess like the big macro thing that I'm hoping is true is, you think about some of this really big thought leadership from people like Mark Cuban, or on the other side, Elon Musk, and, talking about AI and what does this mean for the future of us and what we do.
Yeah.
And I'm really hopeful that, AI aside, that at least technology continues to streamline away the less meaningful and redundant and complicated work and allow us to be more creative. And whether or not what Mark Cuban says is true, and you should not bother getting a computer science degree because you'll either be above the API or below the API, and focus on philosophy degrees. I don't know if we go there, but I do think that this is a trend towards us trying to streamline the work we do, because the more we can abstract away this complexity from our day-to-day work and focus on the more creative and meaningful work, I think the more fulfilled we are. Just generally, I think it's a very human-centric way of thinking about automation and how we work. So, my hope is that that's the direction we're heading, and and the idea of op, whether it's AI ops or whatever. I think this is just like, it's fun vocabulary for people to throw around, and it's just a sign of the times.
Yeah. So I think it's an interesting look, and like what you're saying about Mark Cuban and some of the thoughts on automation in the future world. And I think we've, honestly, like COVID and this time has shown like how important automation can be in so many different aspects of life, from, automated deliveries or, autonomous cars, like how valuable some of these technologies will be when you have a huge instance of an outbreak like this in the future is going to be something that, technology that we're going to need to lean more into even more quickly than we ever thought before. And then when you think about other things that, this like post automation world where, a lot of either you have the there's either the noteworthy people saying, on one hand, you have automation going to this place where everyone's going to lose their jobs and it's going to be all destruction, or AI is going to be really evil. And then you have the other side where like automation and AI allow people to like level up into what humans do best. Like you said, philosophy or creative endeavors, and creative endeavors can include, writing certain types of code or building certain types of products or robotics and things like that. So it doesn't have to be just limited to a lot of the maybe mundane things that humans do today. And I'm really excited personally for as we move into that world. So in essence, I guess, would you say an op is an automation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's kind of how I think about it. I think there's a lot of ways you can describe this, and to be honest with you, it's not all rosy, right? Like you just said, I mean, automation changes, it's powerful, whether it's AI or it's just like you writing something that can automate a set of tasks. Automation is powerful, right? Automation combined with intelligence is even more powerful because now it's in theory adaptable and can evolve. I think this is where the concern comes in, because when something's powerful and it's automated, but then it can evolve, it's going to iterate or progress faster than we as, regular bone and flesh humans can. And this is going to result in things like us having to adapt, and people will lose jobs. And one of the things more practically, for example, like we've seen also, is that it can also act as a leverage point to help people transition into a new approach, right? And so that's how we think about it, is we believe that all developers are going to have to evolve their abilities to include things like DevOps. The world of DevOps is changing, so let's make DevOps accessible so it becomes an enabler of progression, both for us collectively as technologists, but individually as professionals. And then I think from there, the real question is, how fast is it iterating? And, are we automating things that are a good use of automation? And I think there's a lot of things that people automate that aren't, right? Like suddenly, like in the case of DevOps, one of the major concerns we often hear is like, well, I don't want to automate that because I really want to understand it. Because if something goes wrong and I can't fix it because some script or some automation did it and I don't know, I'm abstracted away from that problem. Like, I use the analogy of a mechanic a lot of the times. Like, a mechanic drives a car, but they understand how to change out the carburetor. I think it's really important to balance these two things, because automation can create an evolving pace of change, and it can also abstract you away from the true information that you need to be successful. And so I think like it's a tool to be used wisely, but overall, when used wisely, it enables the individual and the group to iterate at a much faster pace. But you still need to be very aware and conscious of what you're automating, and understand, like, as the individual, the checkpoint that the automation has with you, its ability to interact with you and your ability to direct that automation. That's why we think a lot about the user experience and interactivity of an automation. But that's your sort of ability to then be in the loop of the automation. So we think of this as like a human in the loop automation approach, where, you can use the automation, the op as we call it, to go out and succeed at accomplishing a very complex and time-consuming task. But you also are able to program it in such a way where it asks you the things that it needs to know to make sure that you're still in control of what it's automating. And I think that's really where we find this balance with a human in the loop system, basically.
Yeah. So you have this human technology collaboration, as well as the potential to have more quick and collaborative work while people are stuck at home or working, indefinitely work from home, which we've been seeing is now allowed at some big companies, either through the end of the year or indefinitely, looking at I think Twitter oftentimes makes a big statement, a lot of pizzazz around making a really strong direction, even if it, for the entire company, regardless of, some of the implications, something they believe in, they go for it. What are your thoughts on what, with Twitter saying, hey, you can work from home for forever, and, Google, Amazon, pretty much any big company might end up going work from home for the end of the year. What do you see happening with what the office is, and how does automation and collaboration kind of move into that space?
Yeah, that was a really big announcement, actually, and they've been known for making these headlines a couple times now. I think was it Yahoo that made the opposite announcement a couple years ago, where they had a lot of work from home and they brought everyone into the office. That's a pretty polarizing set of decisions from two relatively similar sized companies. I think given where Twitter's at in in the market and sort of their position and everything, I think it's definitely a smart decision for them. They want to make sure that they're attracting the best talent, and I think ultimately it's also just an inevitability right now that people kind of have to, or most companies should just commit to some degree of remote work indefinitely. I know, in our business, we just communicated to the team that we are 100% work from home for the rest of the year, and unclear after that. But we're also going to work with individuals based on whatever the reopening looks like, because we know that not everybody wants to work from home. I think what I've seen is it's less relevant to Twitter, because I do think that that's a pretty on par trend right now, where it just makes logical sense based on where we're at. But what I have noticed, just from a bit of anecdotal sentiment on Twitter, is it does seem like the people who were massive remote advocates pre-COVID, the people who are remote's the only way to work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and we're the ones who are dying on that hill on Twitter, basically day in and day out. It does seem that they've sort of taken a bit of a position that this isn't remote work. You just remember that you're not working remotely, you're working from home during a pandemic. And what's interesting about that is it's sort of anecdotally trying to, I guess, preserve the integrity of what they think remote was versus what it is now. And then what's interesting is I've also seen a number of those sort of advocates start shifting their tone to be more well, you know what, being in office has a lot of material benefits. And I've actually seen the rise of more of these people who are advocating the idea of in-work and office. So as much as I think remote is here to stay, and I think it's going to be 100% mainstream, it's just interesting to see these different tribes and how their perceptions are changing about this topic now that it's more mainstream. And I think this is kind of what you typically will see in any kind of cultural tribe. I've seen this in bands a lot. There's, some of my favorite bands, we used to call them sellouts because it went to the mainstream. I think you're sort of seeing a little bit of that too now that, the idea of everybody working remotely becomes more mainstream. It's less of a unique thing. And I think that that's where it's going to land. I think we're going to really normalize remote work. And I think some people are going to want to work at an office, but they're going to now become more the unique people, at least within the very tech-centric tribes, right? But I think when you zoom out to the broader world, right, and you get out of technology for a minute, you start thinking about, all the people working in non-tech industries. To be honest with you, I don't know that their worlds change all this much. I think they're still very much going to be heading back to the office, to the store, to wherever for them. I think this is really kind of just like a microcosm of tech, and it's a bit of a bubble sometimes. You got to be careful about that.
Yeah, that's definitely true, right? There's a huge component of people that don't even have the option to work from home, and so but it's also interesting, like you're saying, to see the for whatever becomes the norm, the revolt or the rebellion that happens, and now it's well, no, but working in an office is cool.
Yeah, well, I think it's probably, to be honest with you, for remote people, in some ways it's way harder to work with a co-located team, and in some ways it's way easier because you might be one of some smaller number of people. Now, when a company's fully remote and everybody's remote, then there's a different set of paradigms and a different set of agreed upon practices and these kinds of things. And so I think what we're seeing is the people who typically were who are kind of like taking that position are people who are maybe like they were one of 5 people for every 5 people in the company that were remote. And so they had both the overhead and challenge of working with a co-located team, which can be quite complicated, but they also had the unique nature of the fact that they were remote when others weren't. So maybe they had the benefit of more focus time. But now that everybody is remote and everybody's struggling to communicate over Slack and over Zoom and all these things, well, it kind of like changes the game for them quite a bit too. And that's where I think the real interesting opportunity is here that we need to be thinking about is like, if this is now mainstream and the scales have been rebalanced in such that everybody's remote and now every company who does remote is more of this like remote, fully remote company, then I would disagree with the premise that we're not doing remote. I think we all are doing remote. I think we're just learning, for the most of us, how to do a fully remote organization and understanding what are the tools, the best practices, and the communication that works. Because when you talk about remote, there's different shades of remote, right? Like there's like partially distributed, fully distributed. And if you look into this, there's sort of like the evolution to remote for an organization. And something we looked at quite a bit over probably 2 years. But I think that's what we're struggling with, is we're struggling with the idea or we're going through this sort of transition from like partially remote to fully remote. And it was very abrupt. And so even the people who were working remote, but not part of a fully remote org, they're feeling the shift and change now that everyone else has followed them to this remote setting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Is that still, even if you've already been working, you're working the same way you've always had, when everyone else shifts in your organization or your team, then that brings its own dynamics. Very much like when there's just in the retrospect, when there was just a few people working remote and you still need to include them in like let's say a all hands or a conference room meeting where they, if they're not visually up in the room, they're almost ignored. It's like now there's this almost extreme engagement that happens probably in Slack or email, or basically when you're online all the time. And also there's this level of having to find this new flow when you're also trapped in home, so to speak, with stay-at-home orders. And that's a whole nother, idea of the work from home thing that's going on right now, because there's not as many opportunities to just leave your home and get out and provide that recharge time that was much easier to come by before.
I 100% agree with that. I've noticed a big difference in my own physical and mental, just shifting into this. Like, I've done a lot of remote in the past, to be honest with you. I worked with a lot of remote companies, more often as an individual contributor, so I was able to work more independently. I think what people are now learning also is like, and I've seen some really great tweets on this from different VCs, but there's some really VCs who are really bullish on companies who are being built right now, because they believe that companies who are now learning how to, because I think individual contributors was proven out pretty clearly within these organizations who sort of were partially distributed. Within all remote companies, they understood individual contributor and management. I think most of the companies who were partially distributed or now going all remote are learning mostly what it takes to manage in a remote setting. And what I've learned from this, because it's actually my first time managing in a fully remote setting, is the amount of communication that needs to happen. And the way that I'm doing that over Slack and through a screen, I can actually feel like the physical difference in my brain, where, you know what I mean? Like, it's actually quite exhausting based on how this technique has to happen. But I think once we normalize into that, like maybe physically adapt and evolve or whatever it needs to happen, right? I think once we get there, what these VCs are saying is like, well, now there's a whole generation, a much more widespread number of companies who now have an incredible advantage, because you're not hiring just in your one city, right? You're not hiring wherever.
Yeah.
And to that end, I don't know if you've seen any of this as well, but there's also a lot of articles that were coming out this week, and we're kind of getting outside of DevOps now, but it's very much about the future of work, right? But
still very much applicable to what everyone's dealing with today in their daily work.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of articles about companies people, and like sort of this insurgent of, hey, let's leave San Francisco, let's leave these tech centers, because suddenly the incentive for being in San Francisco is unclear. based on the cost of living and the fact that you're not, really working on a campus anymore. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens there, because I think that might be one of the most material changes that I think could come out of this, is almost like a re-leveling of the playing fields geographically, as this immense amount of technical talent starts to look elsewhere for a different lifestyle and sort of affordability and cost of living scenario that then can still be balanced with the most creative and amazing work that they could do, and how automation enables them to do the most creative work but also stay as connected as possible. And like that's where it comes back to Slack and things like DevOps and the ops process. Is now you could work, you always could, but now you really can, and you can see this mass shift towards my team can work from anywhere, and it's now on the businesses to enable that way of working, because it's mainstream now. It's going to be expected. It's going to be expected that you can dial in from Minnesota and into a company that's like a West Coast Silicon Valley company, which it's hard to say that will even be a thing in the future. We'll see. It depends on how reopening goes and how long we perpetuate this sort of state, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think there for the last decade or decades that everyone's been trying to replicate Silicon Valley and build up the tech and innovation industry in their own cities and geographies. And we're going to see, that now with this is there's going to be a lot of people that don't return back to their home city. They're going to maybe live more out in the country, more in nature. They might move to smaller second tier, third tier cities that have a better quality of life, or maybe not as busy. And now that's going to be this could be the moment that actually it really shakes up that mentality of like, you have to be in Silicon Valley, you have to be in San Francisco. It's already been slowly shifting, and different cities have their own niche in technology, but now it's a huge turning point for that ability, whether it just becomes the alternative Silicon Valley is the internet and work from home.
Yeah, and like I said, I think this puts the burden on the businesses, but also on anyone who's in the field of ops, because the whole point of ops is operations. Your job is to enable an operation. Your customer is an internal customer. It's a employee who used to be able to just come to your desk, ask you a question. You could walk them through how to run that Kubernetes cluster, or generate that report based on how you set up the operations. But now they can't. You have to communicate them over Slack. You have to support them over Slack. You have to support them over these other channels. And that's where I think the burden on the manager, the operations person, like I said, that sort of that adaptability, that evolution that we have to go through, is thinking through what is the best way to enable and operationalize that fully remote workforce. And I think the incentive on those people who are doing those operations, I think there's going to be a higher incentive for them to streamline that experience, make it more accessible, make it more intuitive. I think this comes back to things like Slack, and this is why we saw people like companies like Atlassian purchasing Help, because I think the ops person is going to suddenly realize, the manager is suddenly going to realize that the burden's on them to enable the remote team. If the burden's on them to have observability on what's going on, the burden's on them to communicate and support their teams. And so I expect to see an influx of this idea of the ops, the rise of the ops individual, even further than what we've seen over the prior years. But I think it needs to evolve into more of this potentially chat first, or just very remote friendly kind of way of thinking. Otherwise, the burden will fall squarely back on the manager or the ops person whose job it is to enable.
Yeah. And speaking of observability, I think let's pop into the last segment of our show right now and go into our DevOps drop. We've had Omar from the team write out a blog post on metrics and thinking about delivery metrics, and we talked a little bit about Dora in the first episode, but would love to get your take on that observability and how do metrics come into play when you're thinking about your team and figuring out what to track when it comes to DevOps, and and helping, uplift people and focusing on velocity and productivity.
Yeah, I really like this article. Omar did an amazing job on this. This is actually something that we've been thinking about a lot. It's something that is actually aligned with our product roadmap and where we're going. The idea of what are good metrics, and how do metrics inform teams and managers in the way that we were just describing. I saw a really great tweet by Trevor from here in Vancouver, Trevor O. Look him up on Slack, and I retweeted it yesterday, and he said, metrics are for teams, not people. And I thought that was beautiful, because I think metrics, when you apply it to an individual, it's the wrong thing to do. I think the idea here is teams. And so what Omar is talking about here is this concept of DORA metrics, which was created by this organization, DORA, who were the same people who I think believed during their time at Puppet. So it was Jez Humble, oh geez, I'm losing the second name here. Nicole Forsgren and I believe Gene Kim. They wrote the book Accelerate. I think Jez and Nicole were really fundamental in the State of DevOps report. And what they did is they were surveying all these companies about what are the most important metrics for you to measure in a DevOps team. And so they did this initial research on it, which I think really drives this blog post, and we sort of put it in our own sort of language about how to describe it. What we also did is we went out and we talked to early stage companies quite a bit. And it was interesting to see how few early stage companies understood what DORA metrics are, but they all were very enticed and interested in the idea of having this observability. The big question was always how to measure it, and the problem was it can be really cost prohibitive to implement. But DORA metrics is something that is, like as it says here, it's a result of 6 years of surveys by this really great team who was then acquired by Google, and I believe Nicole is now over at GitHub. And what they've been thinking through is like, how do you measure, and this is a subjective word, but productivity. How do you measure delivery, I guess is a better word, at organizations? And this book, Accelerate, I think is a really great book to read. But what we think about a lot is, this is something that's more common in the enterprise, because enterprise has like a large number of people who are able to kind of implement these kinds of things. We think about like, what does that look like for a more earlier stage business, a smaller team, and how to lower that cost of implementation. So this article that Omar wrote on our blog kind of summarizes some of what's out there, but also highlights links into some of these articles like you have here that really go in depth. And what we're trying to do with this discussion around these metrics is understand like, okay, DORA metrics are what we understand are the best things for the enterprise. Trying to figure out, is that the best thing also for startups? Or do startups actually care about a different set of metrics? And so really what we're trying to do is like highlight what the current knowledge is and start a conversation with other companies about what that might look like in an earlier stage business. Because I think that's something that we're really keen about and think is important.
Yeah, that's why I like your focus on the lean DevOps methodology, so that what are these things that work in a smaller organization when you don't have enough resources and time to track every little thing, but you're still very interested in forward velocity and showing that you're making productive decisions on a daily, weekly, agile basis. So.
Yeah.
Well, Kyle, I don't know if there's anything else on your mind. I know for me, one of the big wins this week was I spelled TJ Holowchuk without having to Google his name. Very excited by that.
TJ Hollowaychuk. It's still can't say it. Yeah, I have the same problem. I could never type it out first try.
Well, there we go. I can type it, but I can't say it. So I'm going to work on that for next week.
Yeah.
Any other last thoughts that you have in your mind right now?
No. Well, two things, I guess. One, speaking of TJ, he's looking at adding WebSocket support to Up, and I think that is an amazing idea. I commented on the GitHub issue, and he responded to me this morning. Anyone who wants WebSockets in an easy-to-use way to implement with API Gateway, please go search out the GitHub issue on apax/up on GitHub and comment a +1 on that. We got to get TJ thinking about this one. Secondarily, when it comes to DORA metrics, we're looking for anybody who has ideas about or passionate about these ideas and metrics to come have a conversation with us in the community. We're thinking a lot and even working on some different prototypes and MVPs that we think could be plugged into any early stage DevOps process in a chat first way to enable these kinds of metrics in like 15 minutes. But what we really want to get feedback on is like, what are the metrics that are important to you? So that's kind of why we're trying to communicate this in the DevOps drop. Please join our community, reach out to us, send me an email at kc@CTO.ai. We're really interested in talking to anyone who's passionate about the idea of DORA or even just generally DevOps and delivery metrics.
Yeah. Just to second that, as always, come into the daily discussion on the community, on our Slack community. It's free, called the Ops community. And we'll drop a link in the description so that you can come join us. You can also find it at CTO.ai/community. So please come share your thoughts. We want to help you automate, help you find the best ways to run your workflows on a daily basis. And the Slack community is the best place to kind of have those conversations and talk directly to the CTO team.
All right. That's another ops show in the bag, I'd say.
That's episode 2. Who knows what sort of background we'll have next. We had the monkey still coming back. I'm really excited for episode 3, and so we'll see y'all next week.
See y'all next week.